Ethical decision making, personal and professional context. Now this is where we really start getting into the actual process for deciding and creating ethically responsible decisions within an organization. During the unit, we'll take a look at one of those age-old questions. Why is it that good people find themselves engaged in unethical behavior? We'll also delve into the impact of managerial roles in our decision-making. And while we may regard ethical behavior as simply doing the right thing all the time, an ethical decision-making process actually goes into a great deal more depth. And yes, there are actual steps to be followed. In an ethical decision-making process, the first step is to determine the facts. What are the most significant pieces of information associated with the problem or the task at hand? Now remember, facts are not opinions. You have to differentiate between them. You also need to take into account the different ways that people may experience or view a situation. These are perceptual differences where the same facts can be viewed and weighed differently by different people. Then we need to identify the ethical issues involved with the decision. And this is where we can slip into the realm of good people doing unethical things. Now suppose you find an iPod somewhere out of the way and you decide to keep it. Well, on one hand, you didn't steal it, but on the other, you didn't try to find the rightful owner either. Basically, issues involving the well-being, happiness, dignity, integrity, freedom, and respect of other people are ethical by nature. And this brings up the concept where we can lose sight of and even fail to recognize ethical issues temporarily. This is called a normative myopia. Walking off with company pens, for instance, can be one of those things that we all do, but yet when we think about it, they can make us feel a bit uncomfortable. Well, the third step is to identify the stakeholders and consider a situation from their points of view, from all the points of view for that matter. Looking at a situation from a variety of angles can help lead to reasonable decisions. Now, by contrast, taking a narrow view can virtually assure leaving out some people, and you do that way too much, and you start to build up bitterness from those you need to have helping you. Then we want to consider the available alternatives. Now, this is sometimes referred to as moral imagination. When we consider how a decision affects stakeholders, we need to weigh and compare alternatives and their respective values to one another. What are the consequences? Are the duties, rights, requirements, and principles involved? And then the implications for personal integrity and character. The text points to an example of how would you feel if your decision was printed on the front page of the Wall Street Journal? Or could you explain it to someone else as being the right thing to do? And can you defend it in public? Ideally, if you follow these steps, the decision itself won't be so monumentally daunting. Sometimes, when all of the important points are fairly considered, decisions tend to make themselves. Still, the action of making the decision doesn't end at all. Remember, the ethical thing to do is also to monitor the outcomes, learn from them, and then make adjustments to effectively and properly deal with future decisions. This is the basic list of steps in reaching an ethical decision. Now let's take a closer look at the individual parts. Remember, we started with determining the facts. Knowing the facts and reviewing the circumstances do much early on to resolve any disagreements that might later erupt into controversy. Knowing and understanding the actual facts also help keep the process focused and pointed in the right direction. Then we identify the ethical issues that may be involved. Now the point here is to recognize that our decisions can include very important ethical issues which then make the resulting action an ethical decision. Now this is where we find people headed in different directions. An ethical decision or issue to one person may simply be some other form of business decision, perhaps financial or operational. In identifying our stakeholders, we have to remember that we're considering any and everyone who might be affected in some way by an organization's decisions and actions. We've already noted that understanding a situation from everyone's perspective goes a long way toward ensuring that misunderstandings can be avoided. But going even further, we can take it to mean that thinking and reasoning from a narrow and personal point of view is a guarantee that an issue is not fully understood at all, or by all, And when you try to push through an idea or a policy that fails to give others their due consideration, you can expect a pushback or resistance. And sometimes that resistance can destroy any chance of ever coming together on a course of action. Now, once again, our next step is to go into greater depth in considering the available alternatives. This is called our moral imagination, and this is seen as the quality that separates the good people, those who are basically good and make responsible decisions, from those people who may be good but fail to make the ethically right call. So now we compare and weigh the alternatives. Now you can start with a mental spreadsheet where you evaluate the impact on all of your alternatives on each stakeholder. Now mentally, this is a way to walk a mile in the other person's shoes or to put yourself in that person's position. Here you can look at the potential opportunities or consequences for someone else. If there are harmful effects, well, you want to be able to think of ways to minimize them. And then, of course, you want to maximize and promote the benefits. It's necessary, though, to do more than just compare the pros and cons. There may be other factors the other person has to consider, such as principles, rights, and duties that may override any benefit or consequence. And what about legal duties or their own codes of conduct? And don't forget as well that you have to consider your own integrity in the decision. Ask yourself, what kind of person am I? And what kind of person would make that particular decision? What habits would I be developing by making this decision? What type of corporate culture would I be developing or encouraging? And how would I describe someone else who behaves this way? And am I willing to defend a particular decision in public? Well, once you've considered all of the alternatives and done the groundwork, then it's time to actually make the decision. You have to be able to justify it or find reasons to support it. Then it's necessary to evaluate the implications that arise from the action. You need to monitor and learn from the outcomes, and then be prepared to change the actions in the future if necessary. And we'll take a look at that most vexing and troubling question of all, taking us right back to the beginning. Why do seemingly good people engage in bad activities and do bad things? Well, first, there are some who simply choose the unethical course or action. Now, that's always a real possibility. Then there are the well-intentioned who fail to choose the ethically right course. There could be some underlying reasons for that. Maybe there's fear. Maybe there's blackmail or what could be perceived as the lesser of evils. That doesn't, however, mean that an unethical act is excusable. Once a bad act is made, there comes the explaining. Of course, there is some ignorance involved. Maybe all the facts weren't known. Maybe only limited alternatives were considered. Was enough of an effort made to consider even more good alternatives that might have worked? Maybe simple decision rules already in place would help the process. Even if a bad decision has to be made, there can be some relief of accountability. Other explanations of bad act can be attributed to satisficing, where you do get some of what you want, a livable choice, even if you don't get the total desired result. And there are also issues of motivation and willpower. Sometimes it's just easier to do the wrong thing. Social circumstances can make it difficult and interfere with good judgment, and therefore it's up to the business management team and company executives to devise and encourage procedures that make it easier to do the right ethical thing and discourage doing the wrong thing. Managers and executives, of course, do set the organization's tone, and they have the power to create and oversee policies to make sure that all employees make ethical decisions. Therefore, the chief responsibility for an organization's ethical policies rests with them. But whether it's the top executive, down-the-line managers, or even individual workers, there's the issue of personal integrity. What kind of person am I? What are my values? And what do I stand for?